It was the sort of summer day that seemed to have been hand-picked by the vicar's wife herself. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and not too much sun to melt the icing on the sponge cakes. In the village of Muchwood Green, such perfect days were rarely wasted, and on this particular Saturday, nearly every respectable soul had gathered on the immaculate lawn of Alderhurst Hall for the annual garden fete. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably seated beneath a striped awning with a plate of seed, cake and a delicate china cup of tea, was in her element. She wore her usual dove-grey ensemble with a sensible hat, and had just made a mental note about the curious way Mrs. Weatherby had twice avoided speaking to her sister-in-law when the first scream rang out. It was not the sort of scream one associates with wasps or spilled jam. It was sharp, high-pitched, and altogether far too genuine for a village fete. The sound came from behind the prize table, where Mrs. Lavinia Hartwell had been arranging entries for the baking competition. There had been much chatter earlier about her lemon drizzle cake being this year's surefire winner. Now, the chatter turned to confused murmurs and stiffened postures as heads turned toward the shrieking. A small cluster formed as guests pushed toward the white canvas marquee, drawn by both curiosity and dread. Miss Marple rose slowly, placing her teacup on the arm of her chair, and began to make her way toward the scene. Not hastily, but with deliberate steps, as if she already suspected what might lie ahead. Inside the marquee, the scent of sugared almonds and fondant icing hung heavily in the air. Past the rows of sponge, fruit, and pound cakes, something darker had invaded the tableau. Mr. Archibald Archie Bream, the local solicitor, lay sprawled over the trestle table like an unfortunate centerpiece. His usually ruddy face had gone curiously pale, save for a slight bluish tinge about the lips. A broken plate lay beneath him, crushed under his weight or dropped in the panic that followed. No one could say. He just collapsed, Mrs. Hartwell whispered, white as clotted cream. He took a bite of my cherry almond slice, and then he was coughing and gasping and let her sit down, someone muttered, leading Mrs. Hartwell to a chair. The local constable, young and ever-eager Sergeant Tom Beach, arrived moments later, summoned by an out-of-breath gardener who had dashed to the village station. He cleared the area with an air of nervous authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, please back away now. Give the man some air. Well, not that it will help," he muttered the last part, eyeing Mr. Bream's lifeless form. "I suppose," said Reverend Mayhew with a strained voice, "someone ought to call for Dr. Partridge." Miss Marple, unnoticed in the hubbub, gently reached toward the crushed remains of the cherry slice on the plate beside the body. Her fingers did not touch it. No, that would be quite improper, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. A subtle gleam in her soft blue eyes marked the filing away of a detail. Dr. Partridge arrived, puffing from the exertion of being summoned from his tea. He knelt, checked the pulse, opened one eye, then stood and shook his head gravely. "Gone," he said. "Not a heart attack, not at that age. He was fit as a fiddle last week when I saw him about a mild case of hay fever. I dare say it might be poison." A stunned silence followed. Then, as if some unspoken code had activated, the villagers' murmurs began. Words like arsenic, cyanide, who would want to, and poor Lavinia were tossed about in low tones. "Poison," Miss Marple repeated softly to herself, barely audible over the crowd. "Yes, cherry kernels can contain traces of cyanide, and almonds too, if one knows where to look. How very curious." She turned, stepping carefully over a fallen paper doily. As the crowd bristled with half-formed accusations and rising panic, she took one last glance toward the body, then to the untouched cakes lined neatly on their stands. Already, she suspected, the murder had nothing to do with cake, and everything to do with the secrets people carried quietly in their hearts. Miss Marple did not return to her seat beneath the awning. Instead, she quietly moved toward the edge of the crowd, now being gently but insistently dispersed by Sergeant Beach. Most people obeyed, drifting back to their half-finished teas and idle speculations in small, murmuring knots. A few stood rooted, as though reluctant to leave the proximity of the excitement. Dr. Partridge had covered Mr. Bream's body with a tablecloth, something garish, embroidered with sunflowers, and was now speaking in a low voice to Sergeant Beach. Lavinia Hartwell sat motionless on a folding chair, clutching a lace handkerchief and staring at the remaining cherry almond slices on the table as though they might spring up and accuse her. Miss Marple's glance wandered. She noticed how Mrs. Weatherby had removed herself to the far end of the lawn, her arms crossed tightly, eyes sharp behind tortoiseshell glasses. Her sister-in-law, Mrs. Flora Ridge, stood not far off, conversing in whispers with a pale-faced young woman Miss Marple recognized as Eleanor Taverner, Archie Bream's typist. Young Miss Taverner was trembling. "Shaken, poor girl," said a voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to find Colonel Lupin, retired and ever attentive to local drama, standing just behind her. He, too, was observing Eleanor with interest. "I imagine so," Miss Marple replied. "She worked for Mr. Bream, didn't she?" "Oh, yes, practically his shadow. Took his letters, typed up his briefs. He relied on her heavily, I believe. That sort of closeness often leads to misunderstandings, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple gave him a sharp look. "I wouldn't presume anything of the kind, Colonel. Though closeness of any nature does tend to bring things to the surface, useful things if one is observant." The Colonel smiled vaguely, not quite understanding her tone. "No doubt the police will have this sorted out by supper time," he said. Miss Marple gave a non-committal nod, her attention already drifting. The sergeant had called 2 young constables from the station to help secure the scene. The marquee was roped off with a rather makeshift-looking length of bunting. It lent a grotesque gaiety to the whole affair, like a fete gone suddenly mad. She moved slowly, purposefully, across the lawn, stopping near Mrs. Hartwell. The poor woman looked dazed, her lips working uselessly, her knuckles white around her lace-trimmed handkerchief. Miss Marple paused and with a gentle smile said in a low voice, "I wonder, Lavinia dear, whether the cherry almond slices were made with bitter almonds." Mrs. Hartwell's head jerked up. I don't know what you mean." "You see," Miss Marple said, lowering her voice further, "ordinary sweet almonds wouldn't contain enough cyanide to do any harm, even if one ate a dozen. But bitter almonds, or apricot kernels, quite another matter. I would never use anything of the sort. That's a dreadful suggestion, Miss Marple." Her voice rose in pitch, causing a few heads nearby to turn. "Of course you wouldn't," Miss Marple said placidly. "But one must consider all possibilities, mustn't one?" Mrs. Hartwell stared at her, breathing rapidly. Then she buried her face in the handkerchief and gave a muffled sob. Miss Marple left her gently and wandered toward the prize table. A constable stopped her before she could get too close, but she'd already seen enough. The cherry almond cake, now partly destroyed, sat next to several others, neatly labelled. A small placard in front of the tray still read Entry Number 7, Mrs. L. Hartwell. The remaining slices looked perfectly ordinary, golden sponge, pink cherries, flaked almonds on top, but Miss Marple was not looking at the cake. She was watching Eleanor Taverner. The young woman had stepped slightly apart from the group and stood now in the dappled shade of a lilac tree, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Her eyes flicked toward the marquee again and again, and once she glanced toward the road, as if calculating a possible escape route. Miss Marple approached her with the same unhurried grace she might use at the vicarage tea. "My dear," she said gently, "you must be terribly upset. Archie Bream was your employer, wasn't he?" Eleanor jumped. Yes, I worked for him. I did. Goodness, I don't know what to say." "There's no need to say anything," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's always a shock when death comes so unexpectedly. Even more so when it arrives at a garden party, don't you think?" Eleanor looked down. He wasn't well liked, you know. No, Miss Marple agreed. I don't suppose he was, but that rarely stops people from pretending they were. I wasn't pretending, Eleanor said quickly. I liked him well enough. I mean, he was always rather short-tempered and exacting, but he trusted me. That meant something. Miss Marple studied her. Trusted you with his work? Yes. And other things too, letters, private ones, sometimes from people who weren't his clients. Personal correspondence? Eleanor flushed and said nothing. Mr. Bream was a widower, wasn't he? Yes. His wife died 5 years ago. Car accident. No children. Just him in that big house on Broadmere Lane. Did he entertain often? Eleanor's lips twitched. Not exactly, but people visited, sometimes quite late. Women, mostly. It wasn't my business, really. I wasn't paid to ask questions. Of course not, dear. But still, you notice things. Eleanor looked directly at her then. Her eyes were glassy but intelligent. Yes, I notice things. Before Miss Marple could respond, Sergeant Beech's voice rang across the lawn. All right, folks. That's enough for today. We've got statements to take. No one leaves. Until we've had a word with you, you'll be called one at a time, and for heaven's sake, don't go touching any of the cakes. This last caused a nervous laugh from the crowd, but it quickly died. Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the edge of the crowd once more, where Dr. Partridge stood murmuring with Reverend Mayhew. She listened quietly. Must have been slipped into the cake somehow, Partridge was saying. If it was cyanide, well, the almonds are the logical source. But the taste, strong, bitter, he would have noticed it immediately. He might have thought it was just the almond essence, the Reverend replied. People use the artificial stuff, don't they? Has a sharp smell. True, still seems strange. You'd have to grind up a fair amount of bitter almonds, or apricot pits maybe, not exactly something you pick up at the grocer's. Miss Marple, to no one in particular, said softly, unless you knew precisely what you were doing. She wandered again toward the rose bushes, where she was less likely to be overheard. There, beneath the blooming pink climbers, she stood for a long moment, one gloved hand resting lightly on the cane she didn't truly need. So far, nothing was quite right. Lavinia Hartwell was flustered, yes, but her distress had the ring of genuine shock. Eleanor Taverner knew more than she was willing to say, but seemed more frightened than calculating. The police, predictably, would focus on the cake. But Miss Marple had been alive long enough to know that poison rarely chose its victim at random. Someone had meant for Archie Bream to die today. And if she were right, the cherry almond slice was only the delivery method, not the motive. The real reason would be nestled somewhere among these fine villagers, in old resentments or buried secrets, human nature being what it was. She gave the roses a final glance, then turned back toward the fete, where the bunting fluttered and the summer day had taken on a decidedly colder hue. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green as the police began their methodical round of questioning. Miss Marple, watching from a discreet distance, noted the nervous glances and hesitant answers that spilled forth like reluctant confessions. She did not hurry to involve herself overtly. Instead, she observed the ebb and flow of villagers' moods, the flicker of guilt, the spark of resentment, the veneer of civility worn thin beneath the surface. Sergeant Beech had taken a keen interest in Eleanor Taverner, who, despite her apparent distress, seemed to hold herself with a composure that suggested more than mere shock. Her lips pressed tightly together, eyes occasionally flicking upward, as if weighing words before they escaped. Miss Marple sensed the young woman was balancing on a precipice, torn between loyalty and fear. Nearby, Mrs. Hartwell hovered close to her husband, a quiet man who had so far said little, but whose face grew paler with each passing minute. She gave Miss Marple a quick, almost imperceptible nod as their eyes met, an unspoken plea for understanding. Miss Marple responded with a gentle smile, one that promised patience. The crowd began to thin as one by one, villagers were led away by the constables for questioning. Conversations became whispers, and the buzz of speculation was tinged with unease. What had started as a day of light-hearted celebration was now overshadowed by suspicion and fear. Miss Marple found herself drawn to the small tea tent where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Mayhew, was attempting to restore some semblance of order. Her carefully arranged plates of cucumber sandwiches and scones sat largely untouched, the bright tablecloth stained with drops of spilled tea. The vicar himself stood nearby, his usual serene expression clouded with concern. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Mayhew began, brushing a stray curl from her forehead, "it is all so dreadful. Archie was a fixture here, some might say an irksome one, but a fixture nonetheless. To think someone would want to harm him, and so publicly." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "it is the public nature of it that strikes most forcibly. Poison is a private act, but the setting transforms it into a statement." Mrs. Mayhew glanced around nervously. "There has been talk, you know, about old grievances, family disputes, matters best left buried, some say." Miss Marple nodded. "Secrets have a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient moments, and murder tends to reveal what polite conversation would rather conceal." Her attention shifted as a young man approached, a familiar face from the village, Peter Chapman, a local farmer and friend of Mr. Bream's. He looked unusually agitated, his hands twitching at his sides. "Miss Marple," he said hurriedly, "I thought you might want to hear something. It might be nothing, but it seemed odd." "Do tell," she encouraged, her interest piqued. Peter lowered his voice. "Earlier today, before the fete got underway, I saw Mr. Bream talking with someone near the churchyard. It was a woman, dressed in black. I didn't recognize her, but they seemed to be arguing. Nothing serious, maybe, but Mr. Bream looked disturbed afterward." "Did anyone else see this woman?" Miss Marple inquired. Peter shook his head. "No one I know. It was early, and most people were still setting up. But it seemed out of place, too solemn for a fete morning." Miss Marple considered this, then said, "Thank you, Peter. That is certainly something to keep in mind." As he walked away, she turned her gaze toward the churchyard. The ancient yew trees stood like sentinels, their dark foliage a stark contrast against the fading light. If a secret had been exchanged there, it would not remain long concealed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Lupin, who joined her with a measured stride. "I hear you have been gathering intelligence," he remarked dryly. "Just listening," Miss Marple replied. "The village is full of voices, and each one tells a story if one cares to hear." The Colonel's eyes twinkled. "Aren't you rather like a cat with a mouse? Waiting patiently?" "Not waiting," she corrected softly. "Observing. People reveal themselves in the smallest details, the way they stand, the words they avoid, the glances they exchange." They both fell silent for a moment, watching as the village fete wound down under the sombre shadow of tragedy. Miss Marple's gaze then settled on a figure standing apart from the rest. Mrs. Flora Ridge, the sister-in-law of the deceased. Her face was a mask of calm, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in her hand as she lifted a teacup. Mrs. Ridge was known for her sharp tongue and quick temper, often clashing with Mr. Bream over village affairs and family matters. "Do you think she might have reason to be involved?" the Colonel asked quietly. "Reason, yes," Miss Marple answered. "Involvement, that remains to be seen." The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to the prize table once more. Her eyes flicked over the remaining entries, the sponges, the tarts, the iced cakes, each carefully labelled with the baker's name. It was as if the murder had frozen the fate in time, the sweetness now a bitter reminder of what had been lost. She crouched slightly to inspect the tablecloth under which Mr. Bream's body had been covered. There, faintly stained and almost Imperceptible was a small smear of dark red, perhaps a drop of cherry juice or something else entirely. Miss Marple's mind began to piece together the fragments of the day, the argument in the churchyard, the secret letters Eleanor had mentioned, the strained relationships among the villagers, and the deadly slice of cake. As twilight approached, the village square grew quiet, the festive chatter replaced by hushed conversations and uneasy glances. Miss Marple remained by the tea tent, her thoughts deep and probing. She knew that beneath the surface of Muchwood Green's quaint exterior lay a web of secrets waiting to be unravelled, and she was certain that the key to this tangled mystery would come not from the evidence left behind, but from the hearts and minds of those who had gathered here today. For now, the village held its breath, but soon the truth would begin to whisper its way to the surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a dusky violet sky stretched over Muchwood Green. The fete grounds were nearly deserted now, save for a few lingering figures tidying up or whispering in small groups. The cheerful bustle of earlier was replaced by an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze. Miss Marple lingered near the marquee, her hands folded quietly before her. The vivid events of the day had settled into a sombre quietude, but in her mind the gears turned steadily. She found herself reflecting on the fragments of conversation, the subtle gestures, and the restrained emotions she had witnessed. Each detail was a thread, waiting to be woven into the tapestry of understanding. Sergeant Beach was still on the scene, coordinating the final collection of statements. He caught sight of Miss Marple and approached with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm grateful for your observations today. The inspector will want to hear them as soon as he arrives. We have a few suspects to speak with, and it's clear this isn't as straightforward as we first thought." "Thank you, Sergeant," she replied. "I hope my humble insights might aid in uncovering what lies beneath the surface." Before the sergeant could respond, a sudden movement caught her eye. Eleanor Taverner stepped out from the shadows near the yew trees. Her face was pale, and she glanced nervously around before approaching Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," Eleanor whispered, voice barely audible. I need to tell you something. It's important." The elderly woman's eyes softened. "Of course, dear. What is it?" Eleanor glanced over her shoulder, then leaned closer. "I didn't tell the police, but I saw something else this morning. After the argument near the churchyard, Mr. Bream met with someone else. Someone he trusted. It was a man, older, with a greying beard. They spoke quietly, but it looked urgent. I don't know who he was, but it wasn't anyone from the village." Miss Marple's mind raced. An unknown visitor, an argument, secret, meetings, all pieces of a puzzle growing more complex by the hour. "Did you hear what they said?" she asked gently. "No," Eleanor admitted. "I only caught fragments. Something about a debt and exposure. It sounded serious." "Thank you, Eleanor. You've been very brave," Miss Marple said kindly. "It is better to speak now rather than let fear fester." Eleanor nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm scared. I don't want to be next." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Fear is a powerful thing, but so is courage. You're not alone." As Eleanor drifted back toward the village, Miss Marple felt a stirring resolve. The day's events had already revealed much, yet there was more to uncover, a hidden layer beneath the polite facades. She decided to visit Mr. Bream's residence on Broadmere Lane before nightfall. It was customary, of course, for the police to secure the scene, but she hoped to glimpse something that might have escaped their attention. The house was a large, imposing structure, surrounded by neat gardens that spoke of care and solitude. Miss Marple was greeted at the gate by Constable Avery, who looked uneasy but courteous. "Miss Marple," he said. Inspector Grayson is inside with the household staff. You're welcome to have a look, but I must ask you to be discreet." "I understand," she replied with a soft smile. "Discretion is my specialty." Inside, the air was heavy with silence and the faint scent of lilacs. Miss Marple wandered through the drawing room where Mr. Bream had often entertained guests. The furniture was tasteful, but austere, the walls lined with bookshelves holding volumes of law and local history. Her eyes fell on a small writing desk near the window. It was cluttered with papers, some folded letters, and a fountain pen resting atop a blotter. She bent to examine the letters more closely. One was addressed to a Mr. R. Hargrove and was stamped just 2 days earlier. The letter was brief but insistent, a demand for repayment and a warning of consequences if ignored. The tone was severe, hinting at a scandal that could ruin a reputation. Miss Marple's thoughts turned immediately to the unknown man Eleanor had mentioned. Could this be him? Richard Hargrove was not a name familiar in Muchwood Green, but it suggested connections beyond the village. As she straightened, a soft voice startled her. It was Mrs. Foster, the housekeeper, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Bream was not a man to suffer fools gladly," Mrs. Foster said quietly. "But he was also secretive, especially since his wife died. He had enemies, Miss Marple, though none of us knew the full extent." "Did he mention this, Mr. Hargrove?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Foster hesitated. "Only in passing. Mr. Bream kept his troubles close, but there were whispers, debts, threats. He didn't like to speak of it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Foster. Your discretion is appreciated." Exiting the house, Miss Marple paused beneath the fading light, eyes scanning the horizon. The village was quiet now, the day's turmoil settling like dust. Her mind turned once more to the fate and the poisonous slice of cherry almond cake. The question was no longer simply who had poisoned Mr. Bream, but why? The motive seemed intertwined, with debts, secrets, and fear of exposure. Back at the village green, the evening breeze carried the faint scent of baking and flowers. Miss Marple's steps slowed as she passed the prize table, now carefully preserved by the police. She allowed herself one small knowing smile. The cake might have delivered the fatal blow, but the true poison was the tangled web of human nature, jealousies, betrayals, and old grudges. She knew the coming days would require patience and subtlety. The villagers would talk, secrets would emerge, and the truth, however deeply buried, would make itself known. For now, Miss Marple walked quietly toward her home, the lantern light from the cottages casting warm pools of glow on the cobblestone streets. In the stillness of the night, she reflected on the puzzle before her, a puzzle she was determined to solve with gentle, unwavering resolve. The morning mist clung softly to the hedgerows and winding lanes of Muchwood Green, lending the village a muted, dreamlike quality that belied the unsettling events of the previous day. Miss Marple, sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of steaming tea, reviewed the notes she had quietly taken during the fete and her subsequent visit to Mr. Bream's house. The pieces were numerous but scattered, and as always, it was the human element, the subtle interactions, the fleeting expressions, that held the most promise for uncovering the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Standing on the threshold was Eleanor Taverner, looking more composed than the day before, though shadows still lingered beneath her eyes. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Come in, do," Miss Marple invited warmly. Eleanor stepped inside, her voice low, but steady. "I wanted to speak with you again, Miss Marple. Since yesterday I've been thinking about the woman in black and the man with the grey beard. I tried to ask around, but no one else seems to have seen them." "That is often the case," Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight, especially when people are afraid or embarrassed. Eleanor sat down, clasping her hands tightly. There's something else. After the argument near the churchyard, I noticed Mr. Bream appeared quite agitated when he returned. But later, during the fete, I overheard a whispered conversation between him and Mrs. Flora Ridge. It was brief, but I caught the words impossible, ruin, and last chance. I don't understand what it all means, but it sounded urgent. Miss Marple nodded slowly, a faint smile touching her lips. Thank you for telling me this, Eleanor. It is a helpful thread. Mrs. Ridge is a person of interest, certainly, but we must tread carefully. They spoke in hushed tones as the village around them began to stir. The morning brought with it the steady drip of gossip, and the local tea shop was already filling with villagers eager to exchange theories about the crime. Miss Marple knew better than to trust casual chatter outright, but it was useful to listen and note what people said and what they avoided saying. Later that day, she made her way to the post office, where Mrs. Pennington, the village's ever-watchful postmistress, greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Miss Marple, we're all quite unsettled. I hear the police are focusing on that young Eleanor Taverner, though I can't see why. She's as innocent as a lamb, if you ask me. Miss Marple smiled politely. People often look for the easiest explanation, Mrs. Pennington, but the truth is rarely simple. The postmistress lowered her voice conspiratorially. You did hear about the letter Mr. Bream received, didn't you? From some Mr. Hargrove. Folks say it was a demand for money, threatening letters, the lot of it. Yes, I have seen such a letter, Miss Marple confirmed. Do you know if anyone has ever mentioned meeting this Mr. Hargrove? Mrs. Pennington shook her head. No one around here. But I did overhear the vicar talking to the sergeant. He seemed worried that Mr. Bream's troubles stretched beyond Muchwood Green. The mention of the vicar brought to mind the churchyard argument and the grim figure of the woman in black. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. Later in the afternoon, as the sky grew heavy with the threat of rain, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage. The Reverend Jonathan Mayhew was a man known for his quiet kindness and thoughtful sermons, and Miss Marple trusted he might shed some light on the village's hidden troubles. The vicar received her warmly in his study, the shelves lined with theological tomes and well-thumbed parish records. He listened carefully as Miss Marple recounted what Eleanor had shared. It is true, the Reverend admitted quietly. Mr. Bream had confided in me on a few occasions. He feared that some matters from his past, before he settled here, were catching up with him. He spoke of mistakes made in business and debts unpaid, but he never gave details. Do you know of this Mr. Hargrove? Miss Marple asked. The vicar shook his head. Only that he is not from our parish. There is a darkness to Mr. Bream's history that many would prefer to keep buried. As they spoke, a sudden knock at the door startled them. It was Sergeant Beach, bearing a small package wrapped carefully in brown paper. Vicar, Miss Marple, he said, this was found in Mr. Bream's study during the search. It was hidden behind a loose panel. The Reverend and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. With a nod from the sergeant, the vicar unwrapped the package to reveal a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant but tense, and the postmark spanned several years. Miss Marple took one letter and read aloud a passage. Your continued silence will force me to act in ways most unpleasant. I am prepared to expose all that you wish forgotten. Repayment is overdue, and the time for leniency has passed. She looked up thoughtfully. These letters are not mere threats. They are the weapon of someone seeking to control or destroy Mr. Bream. Sergeant Beach frowned. But who? And why poison the cake at the fete? The answer, I believe, lies not just in financial matters, but in deeper resentments, Miss Marple said softly. We must consider those closest to Mr. Bream, the family, the friends, even those who seemed polite but harboured grudges. That evening, the village gathered once again, this time for a sombre meeting convened by the parish council. The air was thick with whispered accusations and strained civility. Mrs. Flora Ridge was present, her composure unshaken, but her eyes guarded. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the subtle twitch of her fingers when the letters were mentioned. She recalled Eleanor's words about the urgent conversation between Mrs. Ridge and Mr. Bream, and the weight of impossible and ruin. It was becoming clear that the village's harmony had been a delicate illusion. Beneath the surface lay tensions old and new, financial desperation, jealousies, and the desperate fear of scandal. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the day's revelations. The letters, the secret meetings, the woman in black, the unknown man with the grey beard, all pointed toward a carefully concealed drama. Yet one detail gnawed at her, a small but peculiar observation made during the fete. The cherry almond. Cake itself, with its distinct and somewhat unusual flavour, was crafted by Mrs. Cresswell, the village baker. She was known for her kindness and skill, but Miss Marple recalled the faintest hint of tension between her and Mr. Bream over a disputed debt of her own. Could the cake have been the instrument of murder by someone with intimate access to it? Miss Marple knew that to solve this, she must gently unravel the village's social fabric, observe the cracks in relationships, and listen carefully to what people left unsaid. Tomorrow promised more questions and, she hoped, answers. For now, Muchwood Green slept uneasily, its secrets whispering beneath the quiet night. The early morning sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room as she settled into her favourite armchair with a notebook and pen. The village was awakening, its quiet streets soon to be filled with the familiar sounds of daily routine. But for Miss Marple, the day promised the continuation of a much less ordinary investigation. Her mind turned once again to the cake, that peculiar cherry almond confection which had been the vehicle of such tragedy. It was a detail she could not dismiss, not merely for the role it played in Mr. Bream's demise, but because it suggested a degree of intimacy and planning. The poison had to be introduced before the cake reached the fete table, a fact that limited the circle of potential culprits to those with access to Mrs. Cresswell's bakery or to the cake itself after it was baked. Miss Marple rose and took a slow walk to her window, watching as villagers began their day. Among them was Mrs. Cresswell herself, bustling with purposeful energy as she arranged fresh loaves in her shop window. The baker's face was composed, but Miss Marple recalled the subtle tension she had sensed between Mrs. Cresswell and the late Mr. Bream. With a thoughtful sigh, Miss Marple decided to pay the bakery a visit. The shop smelled warmly of yeast and sugar, a comforting contrast to the grim business at hand. Mrs. Cresswell greeted her with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Miss Marple, what a surprise. Do come in." "Thank you, Mrs. Cresswell. I was hoping to speak with you about the cake you baked for the fete." "It was a lovely choice. Cherry almond, if I recall correctly." "Yes, it was," Mrs. Cresswell replied, her voice steady but guarded. "A special recipe handed down in my family. I'm glad it was enjoyed." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Mrs. Cresswell, did anyone else have access to the cake after you baked it?" "No, no one," the baker answered quickly. "I brought it myself to the village green that morning." The cake was carefully wrapped and placed on the prize table where everyone could see it. I assure you, nothing was amiss. "May I ask, Mrs. Cresswell," Miss Marple began gently, "if you had any disagreements with Mr. Bream recently?" The baker's expression flickered for a moment. "There was a small matter of payment. Mr. Bream owed me some money for supplies. He was not always prompt, but nothing more than that." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you. Sometimes the smallest grievances can fester quietly." Before she could ask more, a sudden bell over the shop door announced another visitor. It was Dr. Paul Henderson, the village physician. His face was drawn, the lines of worry evident. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Cresswell," he said gravely. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I need to speak with Miss Marple privately." Outside on the quiet street, Miss Marple listened carefully as Dr. Henderson shared his latest observations. The autopsy reports confirmed the presence of a rare poison in Mr. Bream's system, aconite, also known as monkshood. It's a toxin that's not easy to come by and certainly not something found in common household poisons. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Aconite, you say? That would suggest knowledge and access, quite specific knowledge." "Yes," Dr. Henderson agreed. "What puzzles me is how it was administered. The cake is an obvious route, but it must have been introduced with great care. I've also learned that a small amount could be lethal, and symptoms can appear quite quickly." Miss Marple pondered the information. "This points again to someone close, someone familiar with poisons or plants. Do you know of anyone in the village with such knowledge?" Dr. Henderson hesitated. "There is one person, the new gardener at the estate of Lady Pershaw, a man named Stephen Crowley. He has a reputation for knowing botany and has studied medicinal plants extensively." "Gardener, you say?" Miss Marple mused. "And what is his character?" "Quiet, rather reserved, but competent. Not much known about his past." Miss Marple thanked Dr. Henderson and made her way toward Lady Pershaw's estate. The sprawling grounds were immaculate, and Stephen Crowley was tending a bed of delicate flowers when she approached. "Good morning, Mr. Crowley," she began with a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Not at all, Miss Marple. How can I assist you?" "I wanted to ask about your knowledge of plants," she said. "Specifically, whether you are familiar with aconite." Stephen's face tightened. "Yes, I know the plant well. It's beautiful but deadly." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Because someone in Muchwood Green has been poisoned with aconite. I am trying to understand how it came to be used." Stephen's hands clenched slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I assure you, I would never harm anyone here. My work is to nurture, not destroy." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly, "but knowledge is a double-edged sword. I must ask if you noticed anything unusual around the fete, or if anyone might have sought your advice on such matters." Stephen hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing. The village is quiet, and I keep to my duties." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she noticed a scrap of paper peeking from his pocket. It was a torn page from a book about toxic plants, aconite highlighted in ink. Her mind raced. Stephen Crowley might be skilled in botany, but that alone was not proof of guilt. Could he have been an unwitting pawn in a larger scheme? Leaving the estate, Miss Marple considered the growing list of secrets. There was the mysterious Mr. Hargrove, the threatening letters, the uneasy relationships within the village, and now this enigmatic gardener with his botanical expertise. Returning home, she found a note waiting for her, an invitation from Mrs. Flora Ridge to join a small gathering that evening at her cottage. The invitation was polite, but carried a subtle urgency. Miss Marple accepted, sensing that Mrs. Ridge had more to reveal, perhaps prompted by the revelations of the day. As dusk fell over Muchwood Green, Miss Marple prepared to step once again into the delicate web of village life, where every smile might hide a motive and every word might conceal a clue. The investigation was deepening, and she knew the answers would come only to those patient enough to listen to the silent language of human nature. The soft glow of the evening lanterns cast long shadows across the narrow lane as Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Flora Ridge's cottage. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming wisteria, a fragrant veil that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of tension Miss Marple felt settling over Muchwood Green. The village had wrapped itself, in polite smiles and small talk, but beneath that veneer lurked unease, secrets waiting to be unearthed. Mrs. Ridge opened the door before Miss Marple could knock, her demeanour composed, but her eyes revealing a flicker of anxiety. "Do come in, Miss Marple. I was beginning to wonder if you would accept." Inside, the cottage was cosily arranged, with lace curtains and soft cushions that spoke of an effort to maintain normalcy in unsettling times. Mrs. Ridge poured tea with practiced grace, inviting Miss Marple to sit. "There are things I must tell you," Mrs. Ridge began quietly, her voice low but steady. "Things I have kept hidden because I feared the consequences, but the events of the fate have changed everything." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Please, take your time." Mrs. Ridge took a deep breath. "It concerns Mr. Bream, and the man you mentioned earlier, Mr. Hargrove. You see, I have known them both longer than most in the village realize. Before Mr. Bream settled here, he was involved in some unsavory business in London. Mr. Hargrove was his partner in those days." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A partnership that did not end well, I presume?" "No," Mrs. Ridge said, shaking her head. "They had a falling out over money. Large sums vanished, accusations were made. Mr. Hargrove threatened to expose Mr. Bream, which is why Mr. Bream came here, to start anew and bury his past. But it seems Mr. Hargrove never forgot." Miss Marple's mind mapped the connections swiftly. The threatening letters, the mysterious figure seen near the churchyard, the urgency in Mrs. Ridge's conversation with Mr. Bream, all pointed back to a tangled web of old debts and lingering grudges. "Do you believe Mr. Hargrove is here now?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Ridge nodded. "I think so. I saw him briefly at the fete, though no one else seemed to notice. He was watching Mr. Bream with cold eyes. I was afraid to speak out before, but now—" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Fear often silences truth, but courage can set it free. Have you any idea why the cake was poisoned?" Mrs. Ridge hesitated, then confessed. "I think it was meant as a message, to warn others who might cross Mr. Hargrove or betray him." As they spoke, a soft knock came at the door. It was Eleanor Taverner, her expression anxious but determined. "May I join you?" Eleanor asked. "I have something to confess, something I did not mention before." Mrs. Ridge nodded for her to sit, and Eleanor began hesitantly. "On the morning of the fete, I found a small vial in the garden behind the village hall. It was hidden among the flower beds. I didn't know what it was at the time, so I tucked it into my pocket, intending to give it to the police later. But I forgot, caught up in the day's events." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A vial? What was inside?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I was afraid. I didn't want to get involved." Miss Marple rose and took Eleanor's hand gently. "Sometimes the smallest acts of bravery make all the difference. Would you be willing to show me where you found it?" Eleanor nodded, relief mingling with resolve. The three women left the cottage together, the night deepening as they walked toward the village hall's garden. The moonlight illuminated the paths, revealing the subtle contours of flower beds and trimmed hedges. At the spot Eleanor indicated, Miss Marple knelt and examined the soil. The vial lay nestled among the roots of a rosebush, its glass darkened by earth but still intact. Carefully Miss Marple retrieved it and held it up to the moonlight. Inside was a small amount of a fine, powdery substance. The colour was pale, almost white. Back at her home, Miss Marple examined the vial under a magnifying glass. The powder was consistent with aconite, the same poison found in Mr. Bream's system. This confirmed what she had long suspected. The poison had been prepared in advance and was intended for use at the fete. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the baker again. If the poison was ready in the vial, how had it ended up in the cake? Did someone transfer it during the baking, or was there another opportunity? The question lingered as the dawn broke, bringing new light and fresh urgency. Throughout the morning, Miss Marple observed the village with renewed focus. She spoke quietly to villagers, noting their guarded responses and the subtle shifts in demeanor when certain names were mentioned. The presence of Mr. Hargrove, whether real or spectre, hung over them like a dark cloud. Her attention returned to Stephen Crowley, the gardener with his knowledge of toxic plants. Something about his calmness under questioning unsettled her. Could he be more involved than he admitted? She arranged to meet him again under the pretext of discussing the estate's grounds, but used the opportunity to observe his reactions closely. Stephen spoke carefully, revealing little, but when Miss Marple casually mentioned the vial found in the garden, a flicker of alarm crossed his face, so brief it might have escaped notice. "You think I had something to do with that?" he asked, voice quiet but edged with hurt. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think you know more than you say. I only wish to understand." Stephen's eyes darkened with a sudden resolve. "Very well. There is something you should know. Before I came here, I was involved in a difficult situation myself, threatened and coerced by men who deal in poisons and secrets. I fled to this village to escape that life. I had hoped to find peace." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Then you are a man with shadows in your past, much like many others here." He nodded. "But I swear, I had no part in Mr. Bream's death. I was shocked to hear of it." As they spoke, a sharp rap came at the door of the garden's gate. Sergeant Beach stepped through, his presence a reminder that the law was never far behind. "Miss Marple, there's been a development," he said gravely. "Mrs. Flora Ridge has reported a break-in at her cottage. Nothing seems to be missing, but papers and drawers have been disturbed." Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with Stephen. The web of secrets was tightening, and someone was desperate to conceal or destroy evidence. Together, they hurried back to the village centre. Mrs. Ridge met them at the door, her face pale but determined. Someone was searching for those letters. "I'm sure," she said, leading them to her study. The papers were scattered and a small cabinet was left ajar. Miss Marple carefully examined the scene. Whoever had done this knew what they were looking for, someone deeply entwined in the village's hidden past. As the morning sun climbed higher, the threads of the mystery wove tighter. The village's peaceful facade was crumbling, revealing layers of resentment, fear, and long-buried secrets. Miss Marple knew that the next steps must be taken with utmost care. The killer was watching, and every move could bring her closer to the truth, or place her in danger. But with a quiet determination, she prepared to follow the faintest clues, trusting in her understanding of human nature to illuminate the dark corners where the real story was hiding. The disturbance at Mrs. Ridge's cottage cast a palpable chill over Muchwood Green that morning, the unease palpable in every whispered conversation and furtive glance. Miss Marple, seated once again in her cosy sitting room, carefully reviewed her notes, weaving together the fragments of information gathered thus far. Each new revelation had not so much clarified the picture as it had deepened the shadows lurking beneath the village's genteel surface. The break-in was a silent alarm, a message from the culprit that they were watching, and that their grip on the village's secrets was stronger than anyone had imagined. The letters Mrs. Ridge had kept, the ones that spoke of the old London dealings between Mr. Bream and Mr. Hargrove, were evidently more than mere reminders of past grievances. They were a threat to someone who would go to great lengths to keep the past buried. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the baker, Mrs. Cresswell, whose cake had become an instrument of death. The baker's reputation for kindness and her established place in the community made it difficult to imagine her as an accomplice. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. The question was not simply who had access to the cake, but who had the opportunity and motive to poison it. She recalled the subtle tension she had observed in Mrs. Cresswell's eyes when The subject had been broached. Could it have been mere anxiety born of the tragic events, or something more? She resolved to visit the bakery again to observe more closely, and perhaps glean something previously overlooked. As she stepped outside, the village was beginning to stir anew. The sun broke through the morning mist, casting dappled light upon the cobbled streets. Miss Marple's path took her past the village green, where a small group of villagers had gathered, speaking in low tones. Among them, Mrs. Taverner's daughter, Lucy, caught her eye. The young woman appeared nervous, glancing around as if expecting someone to follow. Miss Marple approached gently. "Lucy, dear," she began softly, "you look troubled. Is there something you wish to share?" The girl hesitated, biting her lip. "It's nothing, Miss Marple. Just, I overheard something at the fete. Someone talking about a second cake. A cake that was never served." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "A second cake, you say? Do you know who made it?" Lucy nodded slowly. "It was made by Mrs. Cresswell, too. She mentioned it briefly, but said it was for a private order, and that it had been collected early that morning." Miss Marple's mind raced. A second cake, taken away before the festivities. Could that have been the vessel for the poison? Or was it merely a coincidence? She thanked Lucy and decided to pursue the lead without delay. Returning to the bakery, she found Mrs. Cresswell arranging pastries behind the counter. "Mrs. Cresswell, I wonder if you might tell me about that second cake, the one Lucy mentioned. Who was it for?" The baker's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief shadow crossing her features. "Ah, that," she said carefully. "It was for Mrs. Harcourt. She wanted something special for a gathering at her home. A small affair, nothing to do with the fete. Did you see who collected it?" Miss Marple asked. "A young man," Mrs. Cresswell replied. "Tall, dark hair, wore a green jacket. I didn't know him personally, but he was polite." Miss Marple's thoughts turned once again to Mr. Hargrove. A man of few friends, but known for his quiet influence, he might well be the one who collected that cake. Her next step was clear. She needed to speak to Mrs. Harcourt. Mrs. Harcourt's house stood at the edge of the village, its neat garden blooming under the early summer sun. The door was answered by Mrs. Harcourt herself, a woman whose sharp eyes belied her genteel manners. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, ushering her in. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I am following up on the matter of the cake from Mrs. Cresswell's bakery," Miss Marple began. "I understand it was intended for a private event here?" "Yes," Mrs. Harcourt said smoothly. "A small gathering, nothing more. A few friends, some tea and conversation." Miss Marple looked around the room, noting the careful orderliness of the furnishings and the absence of any recent visitors. "May I ask who attended?" Mrs. Harcourt hesitated briefly. "Just a handful of acquaintances. Mr. Hargrove was among them, though he left early." "That's very interesting," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you know if Mr. Hargrove has any connection to the recent events?" Mrs. Harcourt's lips pressed into a thin line. "He is a complicated man, Miss Marple. I suggest caution when probing too deeply." Miss Marple nodded, sensing layers of diplomacy and perhaps fear beneath the surface. Leaving Mrs. Harcourt's house, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the gardener, Stephen Crowley. His past, his knowledge of poisons, and his sudden willingness to share a shadowed history suggested he might be more of an ally than a suspect, but she resolved to keep him under quiet observation. Later that day, as the village prepared for a memorial service in honour of Mr. Bream, Miss Marple met again with Sergeant Beach. The sergeant was growing frustrated by the slow progress of the official inquiry, but he welcomed Miss Marple's insights. "There's been talk," he confided, "about strange comings and goings at the old mill on the outskirts of the village. Some say it's abandoned, but I have my doubts." Miss Marple considered the information carefully. The mill had long been a place of mystery, with its creaking gears and deserted rooms, an ideal setting for clandestine meetings or secret exchanges. "I think it would be wise to investigate," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes the past leaves footprints in the most unexpected places." Together, they made their way toward the mill as dusk began to fall. The building loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and earth. Inside, the shadows seemed to close in, and every creak echoed like a whisper. They found signs of recent activity, discarded cigarette butts, footprints in the dust, and a faint smell of almonds, the scent of bitter almonds often associated with cyanide, another poison. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was no coincidence. The mill held secrets that someone desperately wished to hide. As they explored further, a sudden noise startled them. A figure slipping out through a side door, moving swiftly into the twilight. "Stop!" Sergeant Beach called, but the figure disappeared into the thickening night. Miss Marple was left with more questions than answers. Who was the shadowy visitor to the mill? And what was their connection to the poisonings and threats? The village's quiet facade was cracking, revealing a maze of hidden alliances, betrayals, and fears. Miss Marple knew that the coming days would demand patience and sharp observation. The truth lay in the details, the gestures, the hesitations, the unspoken words, and as the night deepened over Muchwood Green, she prepared to follow the faintest threads that might unravel the mystery of the cake baked with a secret ingredient. The chill of the night air clung to Miss Marple as she and Sergeant Beach returned from the mill, the mystery deepening with every step back toward the village. The elusive figure had vanished like a ghost, leaving behind only the faintest trace of their presence and a swirl of unanswered questions. Miss Marple's keen mind was already at work, sorting through the day's discoveries as the village settled into uneasy quiet. The scent of bitter almonds still lingered in her thoughts, a silent but deadly whisper of cyanide. That particular poison was rarely used without intent and planning, often tied to deep-seated grudges or desperate measures. Whoever had brought it here was no amateur. They understood the potency of their weapon. And yet, why the mill? What secret meetings or exchanges had taken place beneath its shadowed rafters? She knew the answers lay not just in the places but in the people, in the fragile web of relationships that bound the villagers together. Muchwood Green was a tapestry of old resentments, careful facades, and whispered histories, and among these, the key to the murder and the threat against Mrs. Ridge was concealed. The next morning, Miss Marple arranged to visit the village post office. It was a small hub of news and gossip where letters and parcels mingled with the latest tidbits of speculation. There, she hoped, she might find a thread leading back to the shadowy visitor at the mill. Inside, the postmistress, Mrs. Gladstone, was sorting through the morning deliveries with her usual brisk efficiency. She glanced up as Miss Marple entered, her sharp eyes immediately noting the determined set of the detective's expression. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said. "What brings you here so early?" "I'm hoping you might help me with a small inquiry, Mrs. Gladstone." "Miss," Marple replied gently. "Have you noticed anyone unusual coming to the village or any unexpected deliveries in recent days?" Mrs. Gladstone pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, there was a parcel left here last week that I found odd. No name, just a wax seal with an unfamiliar insignia. It wasn't collected for several days, and when it was, the man who took it was in a hurry. Looked like he didn't want to be seen." "Do you remember what he looked like?" Miss Marple inquired. "Dark hair, green jacket," Mrs. Gladstone said, her eyes narrowing. "Tall and lean, I'd say the same man who picked up the cake from Mrs. Cresswell's." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The puzzle pieces were beginning to take shape. The same figure, moving between the bakery, the post office and the mill, was undoubtedly a key player in the unfolding drama. "Thank you, Mrs. Gladstone. This helps a great deal," Miss Marple said warmly. Leaving the post office, she considered the implications. This man, whoever he was moving stealthily through Muchwood Green, gathering items and information. His presence was a silent threat, a signal that the past and present were colliding in dangerous ways. Her next visit was to the village pub, the King's Arms, where the morning crowd had begun to gather. The pub was a crucible of village life, a place where stories flowed as freely as the ale, and the undercurrents of suspicion simmered just beneath the surface. Inside, the familiar faces greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. At the bar, Mr. Jenkins, the landlord, was polishing glasses and keeping a watchful eye on his regulars. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "You're just the person I hoped to see. Folks have been talking about the mill and the strange goings-on. Some say there's more to Mr. Hargrove than meets the eye." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mr. Hargrove has always been something of a mystery." "Indeed," Jenkins agreed. "And then there's Stephen Crowley. Quiet fellow, but the kind. Who knows more than he lets on? Saw him talking to Mr. Hargrove just last evening, looking rather tense." The gardener's name brought a flicker of recognition to Miss Marple's eyes. Stephen's knowledge of plants and poisons was well known, but how deeply was he entangled in these events? As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple listened closely to the murmured conversations, noting the contradictions and hesitations. Villagers speculated on motives and alliances, often contradicting themselves in the same breath. One particular conversation caught her attention: a heated exchange between Miss Lucy Taverner and her mother, Mrs. Taverner. Their voices, though low, carried enough for Miss Marple's trained ear to catch snippets. "You're making things worse, Lucy. Let the police handle it," Mrs. Taverner urged. "But, Mother, if they're wrong, and you know, they are, someone could get hurt again," Lucy replied, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. What had Lucy discovered? And why was her mother so eager to silence her? Deciding it was time to speak with Lucy more directly, Miss Marple left the pub and found the young woman wandering near the churchyard, her gaze fixed on the gravestones. "Lucy, dear," Miss Marple called softly. "May I join you?" Lucy looked up, startled but relieved. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, please." Together they walked slowly among the stones, the silence punctuated only by distant birdsong. "I know you overheard something about a second cake," Miss Marple said gently. "Is there anything more you can tell me?" Lucy nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I saw Mr. Hargrove late that night near the bakery. He wasn't supposed to be there. He met with someone, Stephen Crowley. They exchanged something, I think. I didn't see what, but it looked urgent." Miss Marple's mind raced. The gardener and Mr. Hargrove, the poison, the secret cakes. It was all connected. "Why didn't you tell the police?" she asked quietly. Lucy hesitated. "I wanted to, but my mother, she's afraid. It will tear the village apart. She wants to protect everyone. Sometimes the truth is the only way to protect," Miss Marple said kindly. "Thank you, Lucy. You've been very brave." As the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to Stephen Crowley. His past, the tension between him and Mr. Hargrove, and now this secret meeting, all suggested a crucial role in the mystery. She decided to visit the gardener's cottage before the day grew too late. Stephen greeted her with a wary but respectful nod. His home was tidy, with the smell of earth and growing things permeating the air. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "I heard about the break-in at Mrs. Ridge's, a terrible business." "Yes, and a reminder that someone is desperate," Miss Marple replied. "I wanted to talk about Mr. Hargrove. Lucy saw you two meeting near the bakery." Stephen's eyes darkened. Mr. Hargrove and I have a complicated history, but I assure you I'm not involved in any wrongdoing. Yet you exchanged something. That night? Miss Marple pressed gently. Stephen sighed. Yes, information. He's been blackmailing me for years over things I did in my youth, things I regret, but I never intended to harm anyone. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Regret can be a heavy burden, Stephen, but it can also lead to redemption. He nodded slowly. I just want this to end, for the village to find peace. Miss Marple smiled, faintly. So do I, and I believe we are closer than ever to finding the truth. As she left the gardener's cottage, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to align. The secret cakes, the poison, the clandestine meetings, and the tangled pasts all converged toward a revelation yet to come. Muchwood Green was a village of secrets, but under the quiet eye of Miss Marple, those secrets would not remain hidden forever. The final act was approaching, and with it, the truth baked into the very heart of the cake with a secret ingredient. The village had fallen into a restless quiet by the time Miss Marple returned to her cosy sitting room at St. Mary Mead. The events of the past days lingered in her mind like the fading aroma of Mrs. Cresswell's now infamous cake. The secret ingredient that had brought tragedy and suspicion into the heart of Muchwood Green was still a mystery waiting to be unravelled, but Miss Marple could feel the threads tightening around the truth. As twilight deepened, a soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Chief Inspector Craddock, his expression more serious than usual. Good evening, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Inspector. Please come in, she said, gesturing toward a chair by the fire. I was just reflecting on the curious events in the village. How goes your investigation? Craddock settled in, running a hand through his thinning hair. We've questioned the main suspects, but everyone has an alibi, or at least a plausible one. The poison, the secret meetings, the cakes. It's all tangled, and the villagers are growing restless. I must confess, I'm at something of an impasse. Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes the key is not in the facts themselves, but in how people react to those facts. Craddock nodded slowly. And you have noticed something the rest of us have missed? Perhaps. But it requires a bit of patience and a subtle touch, she said, her eyes twinkling. May I suggest a gathering, perhaps at the bakery, a setting where we might observe reactions without suspicion? The inspector agreed, knowing that Miss Marple's insight had often cracked the most stubborn cases. The next afternoon, the village gathered at Mrs. Cresswell's bakery. The usual bustle was subdued, replaced by an undercurrent of tension and curiosity. Miss Marple watched quietly as villagers chatted in small groups, their eyes flicking toward the hostess and the police presence. Mrs. Cresswell herself was flustered, but determined to maintain the bakery's cheerful reputation. She had prepared a fresh batch of cakes, this time ensuring they were free from any sinister additions, but the memory of the poisoned one hung heavily over the room. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Stephen Crowley, who stood near the window, his posture stiff and wary. Across the room, Mr. Hargrove lingered by the door, his eyes darting nervously. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple engaged the guests in light conversation, gently steering the dialogue toward the night of the poisoning and the strange happenings around the mill. Then, with quiet precision, she introduced a simple question. Has anyone noticed any changes in behavior or strange occurrences since the incident? A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Lucy Taverner hesitated before speaking. I thought I saw someone near the mill again last night, but I couldn't be sure. It was too dark. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Thank you, Lucy. That is helpful. Craddock stepped forward. If anyone has information they have hesitated to share, now is the time. The room fell silent, tension thickening. Then a voice rose from the corner. It was Mrs. Taverner herself, her face pale. I have something to confess. All eyes. turned to her as she continued, "I feared the police would not believe me, but I saw Mr. Hargrove near the mill that night. He was meeting with a stranger, a man who I believe was delivering something. I heard a word, payment." A gasp echoed through the bakery. Mr. Hargrove's face drained of colour. Miss Marple's mind raced. "Payment for what, Mrs. Taverner?" "I do not know," she whispered. "But I believe it has to do with the old scandal from years ago, the one involving the mill and a hidden fortune." Craddock's brow furrowed. "A hidden fortune?" "Yes," Mrs. Taverner said, glancing nervously at her daughter. "The mill once belonged to a wealthy family whose fortune disappeared after the war. There have always been rumours of secret accounts and valuable heirlooms hidden away." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And you think this secret has motivated recent events?" Mrs. Taverner nodded. "I fear so. Someone is desperate enough to kill for it." The room grew heavy with suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the faces, searching for the slightest flicker of guilt or fear. Then, unexpectedly, Stephen Crowley stepped forward, voice steady but resolute. "I know about the fortune. I have tried to protect the village from the chaos it could bring, but I never wanted anyone to get hurt." His admission caused a stir. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was the moment to test the waters. "Stephen," she said gently, "would you care to explain your involvement?" He hesitated, then spoke. "Years ago I stumbled upon a hidden ledger in the mill, a record of accounts and names. I tried to keep it secret, hoping the truth would never have to come out. But Mr. Hargrove found out and threatened to expose me unless I cooperated." "And the cakes?" Miss Marple asked softly. "How do they fit into this?" Stephen swallowed hard. "The cakes were meant as messages, coded deliveries. I never imagined anyone would use poison." Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. "But someone did." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like a shroud. Miss Marple then turned to Mr. Hargrove. "You were desperate, but you underestimated the consequences." Mr. Hargrove's facade cracked. His voice was low and defensive. "I only wanted to protect what was rightfully mine. The fortune belongs to my family." "But your methods have brought tragedy," Miss Marple said calmly. "Poison and fear are poor guardians of legacy." At that moment, a sudden commotion erupted near the door. Mrs. Gladstone, the postmistress, burst in, breathless. "Inspector, there's been another attempt at the mill. Someone tried to set fire to the building." Chaos rippled through the bakery as villagers gasped and murmured. Craddock moved swiftly. "We must act quickly. This is more than a village dispute. It's a dangerous conflict." Miss Marple rose, her calm presence a beacon amidst the unrest. "Yes, but now we see clearly. The greed, the fear, the desperate measures, it all points to one truth." Her eyes locked onto Mr. Hargrove's. "You are the one who orchestrated the poison, the threats, and now the fire, to cover your tracks and secure the fortune." Hargrove's defences crumbled. "I had no choice. The village would have taken everything from me." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "There is always a choice, Mr. Hargrove, and justice will find its way." As officers moved to take him into custody, the villagers watched, a mixture of relief and sorrow settling over them. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple stood quietly outside the bakery. The village was still recovering, the shadows of secrets beginning to lift. Craddock approached her. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your insight has saved the village from further harm." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Human nature is a curious thing, Inspector. In Muchwood Green, as elsewhere, the greatest mysteries lie not in the evidence, but in the hearts of the people." With that, she turned and walked slowly homeward. the evening air carrying the promise of peace, at least for now. The cake, baked with a secret ingredient, had revealed more than poison. It had unveiled the very soul of the village. The evening had settled softly over Muchwood Green, casting long shadows that mingled with the gentle glow of lamplight spilling from cottage windows. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though awaiting the final notes of a long, uneasy symphony to resolve. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, the small fire crackled quietly, and she sat calmly, knitting her familiar patterns, her sharp eyes reflecting a mind still at work. Chief Inspector Craddock was there as well, pacing slowly near the hearth, though he now carried a lighter air than before. The revelations at the bakery had set the village on a course toward healing, but the final piece still lingered in the air, a detail so subtle, so delicately woven, that only someone with Miss Marple's insight could yet perceive its significance. "Miss Marple," Craddock began, "with Hargrove in custody and the truth of the fortune out in the open, it feels as though justice has been done. Yet I can't help but feel there's something else, a thread we've overlooked." She looked up from her knitting, eyes soft but penetrating. "You're quite right, Inspector. The truth is rarely as simple as it seems. Let us retrace our steps, and you will see what eluded us." Miss Marple rose, moving to her writing desk, where she had jotted down her thoughts in neat, orderly script. Recall the cake, the one that caused Mrs. Cresswell's untimely demise. It was poisoned, yes, but the poison was administered with knowledge and care, suggesting familiarity with the household and the victim's habits. Hargrove's desperation was evident, but the actual act required a hand more intimate, more deliberate. Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "You suspect someone else was involved?" "Indeed. Let us consider the last moments before the poisoning. Who was present in the bakery, who had access to the ingredients, and who bore a motive beyond greed?" They reviewed the guest list, their recollections melding with Miss Marple's careful notes. There was Mrs. Gladstone, the postmistress, known for her sharp tongue but steady demeanour; Stephen Crowley, earnest yet secretive; and notably the quiet Mrs. Taverner, whose confession had stirred much but seemed too hesitant, too guarded. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a small, almost imperceptible smudge on one of her notes, a detail she had initially dismissed. A faint trace of almond on a cake slice uneaten by the victim. The poison used was derived from a rare ingredient, often masked by the scent of almond, she murmured. Craddock's eyes widened. But Mrs. Taverner is allergic to almonds. She would have known to avoid it entirely. Precisely. And yet, Miss Marple said, Mrs. Taverner's cautious behaviour and sudden admission hint at deeper involvement. She sought to deflect suspicion by revealing partial truths, protecting someone dear. The inspector leaned forward. Someone close to her. Miss Marple nodded. Her daughter, Lucy. The girl's nervousness that evening. The shadow of fear. In her eyes, there was more than mere fright. Lucy Taverner had access to the bakery, and her knowledge of the household was intimate. Craddock's expression darkened. Are you saying Lucy administered the poison? Not alone, Miss Marple said softly. She acted under pressure, coerced by Hargrove's threats to her family's reputation. The cakes were the message, but the true intent was far more personal. Miss Marple paused, then added, and the hidden fortune was not merely a sum of money, but a symbol of control, power over the lives of those who had long suffered under old grudges. Craddock absorbed the revelation, then rose decisively. We must speak to Lucy at once. The following morning brought a sombre confrontation. Lucy, pale and trembling, confessed to her role, not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a frightened young woman caught in a web woven by others' ambitions and fears. Her involvement had been coerced, her actions born of desperation rather than malice. With the full truth now laid bare, the village began its slow journey toward healing. Hargrove faced justice for his ruthless pursuit of the fortune. Mrs. Taverner grappled with the consequences of her silence, and Lucy was given a chance for redemption under careful guidance. Miss Marple, ever composed, observed the village's return to its peaceful rhythms with a quiet satisfaction. The dark threads of greed and fear had been disentangled, replaced by a fragile hope. As she sipped her evening tea by the window, the gentle hum of Muchwood Green settling into night, she reflected on the nature of human hearts. In every village, every person, she mused, there lies a story waiting to be told, some sweet, some bitter. It is only by listening with care and understanding that we can uncover the truth hidden beneath the surface. The case of the cake baked with a secret ingredient had ended, but the lessons it left would linger. Reminders that even the smallest details, the quietest gestures, hold the power to reveal the deepest secrets. And so, with the village at peace, once more Miss Marple's sharp eyes closed gently, ready to rest, until the next mystery called upon her gentle yet unyielding wisdom.